Hi, my name's Emma Weaver, Deputy CEO at the ADHD Foundation and Director of the Neurodiversity Early Years Service here. My role is to support families and professionals to understand ADHD in very young children, to recognise some of the early alerts for ADHD, but also to explore strategies and ways to support very young children at home or within education settings. So I'm going to spend between the next 10 and 15 minutes to talk you through ADHD in young children and then explore just some of the strategies that we would suggest that might be helpful to parents and carers at home. So neurodevelopmental conditions, there are many of them. ADHD is one. We also know that autistic spectrum condition, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, they all come under the umbrella of neurodevelopmental conditions. Neuro means brain, developmental is how the brain has developed. Now, for children with ADHD, certain areas of the brain are weaker in their development, or we might refer to it as delayed in their development. So understanding the early brain and how it grows is really important to understanding ADHD in little ones and young children. Now, if you imagine the human brain, it develops from the bottom up. Now, if you picture it a little bit like a high five, the first part of the brain to develop is what we call the brain stem, which would be the wrist on the hand model, or on the picture on the screen, it's the orange section of the brain. Now, the brain stem is really important. It's our basic survival function. It regulates our temperature, our heart rate, and our breathing. Without the brain stem, we wouldn't be here. But the brain stem also plays a really important role in sensory integration. What happens with our senses, so sight, sound, taste, touch, smell, proprioception, interoception, and vestibular balance, those senses are giving us information. And that information is coming from the environments around us or from our internal signals. Now, those signals are sent to the brainstem, and the brainstem's job is to send the information to the top part of the brain. Now, this part of the brain goes through a rapid period of growth from the moment of conception, and it continues to grow during time within the womb. The next stage to develop is what we call the cerebellum. And the cerebellum on the hand model sits about here, but as you can see on the picture, it's the bluey coloured section of the brain, the bluey green. And the cerebellum is really important for movement. Now, we can often see for some children what we would refer to as an early alert for ADHD at this stage of development. Now, this stage of development is from birth to around 2 years, is where it does its rapid period of growth. And this is what you might recognise as the crawling stage of child development. But when a child has ADHD, what we sometimes see at this age and stage of development is children with difficulties or crawls that might not be your classic crawl that you might think about, which is one hand and one leg in front of each other. I've worked with many families where they've said, actually, at the crawling stage, so at this age of early child development, what they recognised was that their child walked very quickly, or that their child had a funny crawl. It might be that they did more of a commando crawl, or what we refer to as a bum shuffle, but they maybe didn't necessarily do the classic crawl of one hand and one leg in front of the other. Now, when we miss out on that stage, or we don't get as much opportunity to develop at that stage, what that leads to in some children is a weakness in what we call proprioception. Now, proprioception is your body's coordination. It's the sense that helps you to understand what direction you're going in, but also how your body moves in space. For children who have weaknesses with proprioception, what we sometimes see is children that need to move a lot more. Also children that like to climb and children that need a lot of physical input and body movements. Now, this is often at this stage where we can start to see those early alerts for ADHD. The next stage to develop is the limbic system, and the limbic system sits nice and neatly in the middle of the brain. And the limbic system is our emotional centre. It's our fight, flight or freeze. It's the part of our brain that's very impulsive. It's not particularly logical, but it's very driven by how we feel. Now, this is the stage where we often see, and we refer to it as toddler tantrums, but this rapid period of growth is between 1 and 4 years. And then the final stage to develop is what we call the cortical brain. And the cortical brain, rapid period of growth between 3 and 6 years, but continues to mature as the child grows. And the cortical brain is the learning part of our brain. This is the part of the brain that helps us to plan, organise, problem solve. It also helps us to interact with other people and use language. Now, in a typically developing child, what happens is from the early years and through as the child matures, this part of the brain starts to strengthen. And as it strengthens, it starts to sit nice and neatly over those lower brain primal regions. Now, that's a child that doesn't have ADHD or another neurodevelopmental condition. What the research tells us about children with ADHD is that the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of the top brain, is delayed in its development. So what this looks like in children, and often we refer to the phrase of, lots of our children with ADHD will do what we call flip the lid. Now, when they flip their lid, what we often see is maybe some more of those lower brain-based behaviours. Now, in our little ones, what that might look like is a child that needs to crawl, a child that likes to be up high, a child that fidgets and squirms and finds it very difficult to sit still for long periods of time because of that cerebellum brain, or a child that maybe is struggling with their emotions, regulating their emotions and managing some of their big feelings. Or because of that flipping of the lid, what we might also see is difficulties in learning and development because of the delay in the area of the brain that helps us with those skills. Now, ADHD stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. Here at the ADHD Foundation, we prefer to refer to it not as a deficit, because deficit would suggest that a child with ADHD is lacking in something. They're certainly not lacking in anything. If anything, it's a dysregulation. So a child with ADHD, they can regulate their emotions and they can regulate movement and they also can regulate their concentration, but they often need lots of support to be able to do that, to become regulated in those key skills. Disordered at the end of our title, which we don't particularly like because disordered is quite a negative way to describe a condition. So we would prefer for it to be referred to as condition. But at the moment where we stand in the DSM-5, and the DSM-5 is the manual that we use to diagnose neurodevelopmental conditions. The title currently, and is staying that way for a little while, Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. So that's what ADHD stands for. Now, ADHD in the early years can be difficult to pick up on. And the reason for that is because of how the brain develops and because it's going through that really important stage of brain growth. Research tells us that in the first 5 years of life, the brain has grown by 90%. So 90% of the brain and what that's going to be in adulthood has grown rapidly between 0 and 5. It's called a sensitive period of time. So that's why it can be difficult to pinpoint neurodevelopmental conditions, because we're trying to work out, is it growth and is it development, or is it a difficulty because of neurodivergence? So what we prefer to look at is some of the presenting behaviours that we might see in the early years. And there are key themes in early child development that often can be our early alerts for ND conditions. And those key themes are sensory integration or a need for movement. So we might see children with a need for that input. We also see a key theme around emotional self-regulation and managing big feelings. There's also something called our executive function development, and that's the top brain, and that's our learning brain, our planning, our organising, our problem solving. And then the final key theme in early childhood is theory of mind. And theory of mind is the ability to see things from other people's perspectives, understand emotions of other people, also understand other viewpoints of other people. Now, when you're 3, these key themes are often not embedded. You need lots of support around the age of 3 to manage these 4 key themes. But what happens as children grow and as they learn new skills is there is an expectation that these key themes become much stronger as a child reaches around the age of 6 or 7. Now, if your child has ADHD, there's a chance that there might be some difficulties with some of these key themes or all of these key themes. Now, because today's webinar is only a short webinar, I'm just going to focus on sensory integration and the need for movement and some strategies that might help you with your child at home. And I'm also going to focus on emotional self-regulation and ways that we can support our children at home to manage and regulate their emotional control. So movement is key when it comes to ADHD. There's a really important neurotransmitter called dopamine, and dopamine moves around the brain and around the rest of the body. People with ADHD have a dysregulation of dopamine, which means that sometimes their dopamine doesn't flow consistently as it might do for a child without ADHD. Now, what we know and what the research continues time and time again to tell us is that dopamine increases through movement. So it's really, really important, particularly in the early years, that children get lots and lots of access to opportunities to move, to climb, to crawl, to develop that proprioceptive sense, which is that physical movement. Because if we can strengthen the proprioceptive sense, that's going to really help a child when they join school to be able to sit, to be able to concentrate, but also to be able to coordinate their body as they're moving around the school environment, but also as they're moving around the home environment too. So some strategies that you can use at home. Monkey bars can be a really great starting point. Any play equipment where children can pull their bodies up, move their bodies around, have their bodies upside down if they need to be. Yoga can also be really helpful, but also having lots of access to things that allow children to fidget. One particularly lovely one, and this was a parent that I met not that long ago, is she made a fidget cushion, which is the picture at the bottom right there. Now, she used the fidget cushion with her little one at times when they wanted to sit down as a family. So it might be whilst they're watching the telly together. Their child had a cushion, and on that cushion there was lots of zips, fasteners, buttons, basically anything that the child could sit and fidget with whilst concentrating on a film or concentrating on family interactions. Now, by allowing those opportunities to move, the child was then regulating their dopamine, which was helping to regulate their attentional control. You can see the picture on the left-hand corner of the slide there, and that's called a tinkering station. Now, this was created in one of the schools that we work with, but I've also seen a family that have created this at home. And I suppose here in the UK, we call them busy boards, but it's a board that you would attach things to, which would help children to play and use some of those fine motor skills to develop that movement and to develop that core control. But if anything, if we're going to focus on any particular movements, anything that's going to use cross-body activities can be really helpful. So that's where climbing walls, getting outside and climbing trees can be really helpful. Doing things like climbing, crawling underneath cargo nets. I've got one family and they've got tyres that they use, and the children will move around the outside of the tyres, or they'll step their feet and cross their feet over as they walk across the tyres. Balance beams, anything that's going to mean that the child has to think about how their body is moving in space can be really, really helpful and a really great starting point for little ones with ADHD. Another lovely idea is what we call our sensory circuits. And a sensory circuit is basically a mini assault course where we focus on 3 key areas. The first stage of our sensory circuit is what we would call the active stage or the alert stage. Now, we would spend around 5 minutes on this part of the circuit. And this would be activities that get the heart rate going. This activity, if we can include what we call vestibular movements, so anything that's forwards, backwards, side to side or upside down. So star jumps, bunny hops, row, row, row your boat can be really good at step 1. Step 2 is the organising stage of the sensory circuit. So this is activities that help to organise our physical movement, so cross-body activities. So the activities that I said on the slide before, like climbing, balance beams, crawling, anything where a child is going to cross their body and do an activity where they've got to reach to the other side of the body is great for the organising stage. And then step 3, and apologies, I've realised I've got step 1 written there, but that's meant to say step 3. Step 3 is the calming stage. And the calming stage is any activity that's going to help children to calm after the sensory circuit. So this might be activities like breathing techniques. One family that I work with, the children lie on their backs, they pull their knees up to their chest and they rock from side to side for a count of 10 seconds. Heavy weighted activities can also be really lovely at this stage. So using activities where the children can squeeze their bodies or squeeze into small spaces can be a really helpful strategy for the calming stage of our sensory circuit. Now, a sensory circuit can be done anywhere. It can be done in the local park. It can be done at home, in gardens, inside the home. But as long as we follow each step, active, organising and calming, and we spend 5 minutes on each step, it can be a really, really great intervention that can be really supportive for our little ones with ADHD. Now, that's some strategies for movement. And I want to talk to you about a 3-step approach to emotional self-regulation. Now, because of the age and stage of our children, but also because of ADHD, what we know is that often lots of our children are struggling with some of their big emotions. We refer to it as emotional reactivity. Now, a strategy that we talk about is the 3-step approach to helping children to develop independent skills in self-regulation. Now, each step we have to do 1 step at a time. So the first step in emotional self-regulation is understanding emotions. Children need to understand the language of emotions and also what that means. Once they've got understanding, we can then move on to step 2, which is helping them to recognise how their emotions feel inside their bodies. So the physical response that they get from their emotions. And then finally, if we've understood, if we've recognised, we can then help children to know what strategy they can use to then regulate their emotions. Now, language is key. So at home, deciding what language you're going to focus on when it comes to helping your child understand emotions. Now, for young children, it's best to just focus on the first core emotions. If we can focus on happy, sad, worried, and angry, they are the first prime emotions that we can start to embed an understanding for our children at home. Now, to help children understand, there's lots of ways that we can do this. One being, label the emotions when we see our children experiencing them. So having a sentence ready, saying to your child when you see them happy, I think that you're happy. Or I think that you're sad. I think that you're worried. I think that you're angry. Now, to begin with, we just label those 4 core emotions when we see them. I think you are. We can also display emotions at home. This is a lovely example. They've used a mirror, and around the outside of the mirror is lots of images of children pulling different facial expressions. Now, the children can go and look in the mirror and practice those facial expressions, but they can also see them visually, what a happy face looks like, what a sad face looks like, what a worried face looks like, and what an angry face looks like. Now, if we can use real life facial expressions, that really helps our children who maybe have difficulties with theory of mind, because we're demonstrating to them what a face looks like when they feel and experience different emotions. And that can be really helpful when it comes to understanding emotions. We can also use books and we can use videos to explore emotions. When you're reading a book, just talk about with your child, how do you think this character is feeling? What do you think this character is going to feeling next when this happens? You can watch videos, YouTube clips can be really helpful. You might also want to play games, and whilst you're playing those games, talk about the emotions. You know, if they're starting to get frustrated, label it and talk about it. So what we're doing at this stage of this approach is we are just indulging children and helping them to understand the language, focusing on those 4 core emotions and labeling them when we see them, but pointing them out in books, in videos, and helping them to understand those words. The next stage of this 3-step approach is the recognizing stage. So what we now need to do is, after a few weeks of labeling the emotions, we can now up-level the emotions, the emotion labeling. And what we can now do is label the emotion, but also label the physical feeling that we see. So what we might say to our child is, I think you're feeling happy because you're smiling. I think you're feeling sad because you're crying. I think you're feeling worried because you're biting your bottom lip. Now, depending on what you see in your child will depend on what you label. But at this stage, what we need to do is we need to label the emotion and the physical feeling. Now, we can do an activity which is really lovely, which can further help our children to recognise their emotions. And it's what we call the body outline. So if you can get a big piece of chalk and take them outside, get them to lie down on the ground and draw around the outside of their body. You can do it on a big piece of paper with a pen, or you can just draw it on a piece of paper if you want to. Now, once you've got that body outline, you then ask your child, whereabouts in your body? When you're feeling angry, where do you feel it in your body? Now, I've worked with children as young as 3 and 4 who have said things to me like, I get a dragon in my tummy. I worked with a 4-year-old who said his head feels like it gets really big. I worked with another little boy who said that he gets lightning in his feet. Now, when they're describing those physical responses to their emotions, what they're guiding us is for us to understand what regulation strategy might be helpful for them. So a child who's got lightning in their feet would really benefit from some activities that help them to get that feeling out of their feet. So stamping, using resistance bands. Resistance bands can be great. They hook onto the child's feet, and the child can pull. And that pull gets that real kind of sense of pushback on the feet that can be really helpful. Wall push-ups can also be really helpful for the feet. A child that says their head's getting really big, or that their breathing changes, or you're observing that, they might really benefit from some breathing exercises. So at this point, all we're doing now is we're labeling the emotion and we're labeling the physical feeling. After we've embedded that, and after we've done that for a number of weeks, we can then guide them to the regulation strategy. So once we've seen what the body's doing, we can then recognise what the child needs. And here's just some lovely examples. We could teach them some breathing exercises. Square breathing is a lovely one. You can get square breathing on YouTube to see how to do it. But actually, in any environment that you're in, you'll always find a square. And it's about teaching our children to follow the outline of the square whilst taking some big deep breaths in, holding the deep breaths, and then breathing those deep breaths out. One of my favourite strategies is getting a big feather, a little bit like the one in the picture on the left-hand side. Children hold the feather and they've got a job to do. And their job is to take a big deep breath in and blow the feather and see how long they can keep that feather horizontal for. Now, what that's doing is that is teaching breathing, but actually it's a great distraction technique as well. I worked with a family and they made relaxation jars, and that's the picture in the middle. If you can just get an old food jar, clean it out and take the stickers off the front, fill it with lukewarm water and pop some glitter glue in there. Get the child to shake the jar up, and while the jar is being shook, all the glitter moves around the jar very, very fast. We then ask the child to put the jar down on the table in front of them and to just take a minute to breathe and to think. And naturally, as the jar is on the table, the glitter starts to settle and reduce to the bottom of the jar. We then have a conversation with our child and say that when we slow down, when we breathe and take time, what the glitter does is it settles to the bottom of the jar, but so do our emotions. So we're just promoting the importance of slowing down and taking some time to breathe and relax. Now, that's if a child's demonstrating fast-paced breathing or a busy mind. Some children, when they become emotionally dysregulated, they might become quite physical. And these children are the children that need regulation strategies that focus on movement, but focus on heavy weighted things as well. So resistance bands we spoke about, which is the picture at the top there. And resistance bands are great for pulling with your arms and hands. They're great for your feet. I work with one family and they've attached them to fences outside and the children just pull them. You can also use weighted resources. Now, just a word of warning, if you're using weighted resources, please make sure that you read the instruction labels carefully, because you need to make sure that the weighted resources aren't too heavy for your child. So only use weighted resources if appropriate for the size of your child. But lovely activities that you can do that can help to regulate. Using a heavy wheelbarrow in the garden. Fill it with some mud and get the child to move the wheelbarrow around the garden. That can be a really great activity to help regulate emotions. Carrying heavy objects, helping with bringing the heavy shopping in. That can be really regulating as well. I've got one little boy and he uses a sleeping bag. Dad puts him in the sleeping bag, rolls him up forwards and backwards until the sleeping bag is just a little bit tight, not too tight, but tight enough that there's a little bit of squeeze happening. And then they just squeeze his body from his shoulders down to his toes. And that's another lovely regulation strategy. So just to reflect on that three-step approach, we need to take all three steps to promote independent self-regulation. Step one, help them to understand the language, help them to understand the emotions by labeling them. Step two, help our children to recognize how their emotions make them feel by labeling the emotion and the physical reaction. And then step three, help our children to regulate. Show them what they need to do when they're feeling a certain way. And hopefully, taking that three-step approach will start to support your child to develop their understanding of their emotions and what they need to do when they're experiencing those big emotions. So thank you for taking the time to listen and watch today's webinar. I hope that the information's been useful. If you'd like some further information, please look at the ADHD Foundation website, www.adhdfoundation.org.uk, where you'll find lots and lots of resources on the Early Years and Key Stage 1 service webpage. Lots of resources that you can download, read online, or print them off and read them, or pass them around to family members or teachers or early years professionals that your child is meeting. So thank you for listening to my session today, and hopefully we'll get to see you in the future for more sessions. Take care, everybody.